We have Julianna Lamb on the episode, guys, CTO and co-founder of Stitch. It's a really exciting episode. Julianna, thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to have this meeting today.
Thanks for having me on.
Awesome. Julianna, so selfishly, I'm using this episode as a way to really motivate my friends who are women in tech to start companies and just take that leap. You hit $1 billion in record time in just 2 short years. I want to learn more about how you validated product in the early days and how you went 0 to 1.
Yeah, definitely. So I think a lot of kind of like the story that you don't necessarily see is like everything that happened before we started the company. So like 2 years looks very short, but there's like so much history sort of like underneath that of working in similar spaces, working on similar problems before we ended up sort of like taking that leap. And so I think we were pretty conservative in terms of deciding like, okay, it's like time to quit our jobs and go and start this company. And once we did that, we had, I think, a really sort of like concrete plan that we mostly stuck to in a lot of ways. We obviously like evolved and got new feedback and changed that plan. But I think the like really interesting piece is probably around kind of like that initial discovery and like kind of like coming up with the idea to begin with. So my co-founder and I both worked at Plaid, and I spent a bunch of my time there working on problems related to fraud detection and prevention. So protecting against things like credential stuffing, account takeover attacks. We built out a bunch of different auth features there as well. Looked at a bunch of different vendors, ended up building a ton in-house. I worked at another company then for a bit where we ripped out Auth0 and replaced it with an in-house Auth solution. And so it's kind of like that second experience of being like, okay, there's like really not a vendor that's sort of meeting our needs that feels like it was kind of like the modern dev tool that we would expect. Very like powerful API oriented, composable and flexible. Like Auth0 is a very sort of opinionated product. It's like a full page widget that sort of owns your entire login experience. And that just like isn't how I think people build software in the 2020s, right? You want to be able to like really have a great like design aesthetic and own your UX and stuff like that. So we kind of first had this idea. I don't even think I would describe it as like we had an idea to start a company, but we just like were complaining about there not being better authentication tooling back in 2019. And then we didn't end up starting the company until June of 2020 and spent some of that time just kind of like talking to people and getting their feedback. We were like, we think this is a pain point. We're not finding a better tool, but is this actually a pain point? Are we missing something? And I think like both of us were kind of like open to the idea of starting a company, but I don't think we were like set on starting a company right then and there. And the reason we ended up doing it is that I think we just felt so much pull over time of people resonating with our idea, having really concrete sort of like pain points with Auth0 that our solution would be a really good antidote for. And so kind of like momentum built and we were like, okay, we have to go and do this. And so by the time we started the company, I think we had like a good sense of kind of like what we were setting out to do. Obviously have learned so much in those like 4.5 years, but there's like all this pre-work that let us like really hit the ground running when we actually started the company.
Absolutely. Most successes aren't overnight, right?
Exactly.
And what I want to learn more about is that groundwork that you guys put in. So while you were working, you're taking in calls and like validating product to make sure that, am I right, building in the right direction? A lot of builders, I find these days, they just build without thinking too much. And I don't know if that's like the best allocation of resources or mental space. So I really liked what you guys did, which was just getting on the calls, right? I know it was during the pandemic, so people were inside, so they're more willing to take calls. Fair. But you know what? I don't have problems getting on calls. I got on a call with you. So you know what? I think that's an excuse. So tell me more about like what criteria did you guys have? And did you have a very clear criteria in determining like this is actually like a genuine pain point. Yes, like of course, yeah, you're coming with it from like a primary data standpoint of you've experienced this pain point yourself as well. But there's always like a different like angle when it's other people's problem versus just your own. So I want to hear more about like the criteria you guys had when you're taking in these calls to validate product, to actually identify the specific like things that you'd be listening for when people were talking to you about their pain, to address like, okay, this specific thing.
Yeah, so I don't think we started with a super concrete plan. We kind of like were like laying the bricks as we went. But I think the initial thing that we wanted to dig into was just like understanding what other people were doing for authentication, for people who were using Auth0, like what was that experience like? What were limitations they were running into? What were some of the like things that they wanted to be able to build that they couldn't build? Was this like a pain point that was severe enough that they would consider a migration too? We knew that it would take time to like build out kind of like the infrastructure and platform to be able to be like a decent rip and replace for an like fully built out auth system. And so we weren't trying to get like LOIs or have like concrete commitments, because we were kind of like, we're unsure like what this build time is going to look like. But what we want to validate is like, do enough people have like the same types of pain points that we think our solution would be like uniquely suited to solve? And does it feel like this is a problem that is severe enough that people are like open to the idea of migrating? I think we knew that that was like definitely something that happened, because I had been through this experience of ripping it out. But it's a pretty sticky type of product. Like you start building authentication into your like data model, right? And it just like kind of permeates from there into all different pieces of your code base. And so ripping it out, depending on kind of like what you've done, can be a headache. But we felt like if people had a good kind of like sense of like quantifying the benefit of moving to something new that would unlock these additional features. So those are kind of like the types of things that we are really trying to dig into, of like, what are the pain points you're running into? What would your like kind of ideal solution here look like? And what would it take for you to migrate to a new provider? And I think to your point, like people are happy to like get on a call and like complain, especially if they know they're not like being sold to in that moment. Like I think as soon as you're like bringing in some element of a sale, people get like a little bit more like gun shy. But I think if this is a pain point that's like big enough for someone, they're going to be happy to like rant about the frustrations they have. And so it was pretty easy to get people on the call. I think we definitely had the benefit of like, it was early COVID and people were just like sitting at home on the weekend. And so it was like really easy to be like, hey, let's catch up. And like, oh, by the way, like, what are you doing for authentication? But I think regardless, your point is totally right. Like, I think people underestimate like how happy people are to like complain about a pain point they have.
True. And when you're like talking to your early customers before you have the product built out, like I know you raised your seed round and then you started like hiring and building really aggressively. But before that, when people were asking you, okay, like, yeah, I would trust you with doing this migration. It's not like a clear LOI, but they would just say like, yeah, this product, it would make sense for me if you built it, Julianna. How long would it take you to do a migration? And this is like before you even have like your engineering team really built out. Like, how would you answer that question, or did it even come up?
Yeah, I don't think we got into the specifics of like how long it would take to do a migration. I had that experience having like done the Auth0 rip out, so I kind of knew like overall what that process looked like. And like what some of the key things that we could build to help make that migration even more seamless. But I think it was more around kind of just like, typically the people we were talking to were like an end leader. So someone with like the sort of like buying power of like, okay, what would it take for you to like get comfortable like prioritizing this migration and switching to a new tool? Like, what would it take for you to dedicate your engineering resources to that, right? So it was more about kind of like, what is the value that we would have to deliver for this to be like something that could be compelling to you.
Makes total sense. Yeah, engineering hour is gold, right? Everyone has limited engineering hours, and they really don't want to spend it frivolously. So that's a huge validation point as well, when they're willing to tell you, yeah, I am willing to switch over and dedicate engineering hours to this. So that's really cool. And I love that about dev tools, that you can have that effect. Now, like, I'm also really curious here. You started off with a self-serve open beta, right? How many users did you have on there when you first launched? What did you do to prepare for that launch? Like underlying hype, some marketing, like what did you do there? And yeah, we'll take it from there.
Yeah, so we started with basically kind of like trying to get really good initial feedback before we went to that beta. And part of the strategy there was to like get on calls with people and just like have them like try integrating the product, see how that went, get their feedback, and like I think build kind of like some momentum then of like people having tried it out, so that when we went to launch it, there were people that could like, you know, hype it up immediately because they'd already had experience like trying it out. We were really focused on building a great like developer experience with our sort of beta. So basically what we wanted to do was focus on one auth product, but do a fully sort of like built out dev experience around that one auth product, so that we could then go and like really quickly add additional products. But we felt like nailing kind of like, okay, what are the docs like? What are the SDKs like? All of that was going to be really important. And so getting that initial feedback, really getting some like early kind of like test use cases. And then I think our philosophy was kind of like, it's better to just like put this out there and like see how it goes versus like try and like do a huge launch for our like initial beta. We want as much feedback as possible, and we want to like get as much like kind of like genuine feedback too. Like the early feedback was very manufactured of like, hey, this is like a friend, like try this product out. And we wanted like unbiased feedback of, are people willing to like come and try out this product because they're excited enough about what we're building. So we ended up doing like our full public launch probably like 6 months after that initial beta. And that was where we more focused on like, let's do the press announcement and like try and do a whole thing. For the open beta, we just kind of like, tried to get some of those initial adopters to help kind of like spread the word. And then we just put it out on like Twitter and maybe LinkedIn. I think Twitter was more, I think like, I don't know, where tech stuff was happening back in 2021. And I think we were like not anticipating too much happening, but I think we got like a few hundred signups like pretty quickly. And we had someone go live like within a couple hours of that tweet going out, which was like mind blowing to me. Like I thought people were going to like, you know, sign up and like try it out over a couple weeks or something. So I think that ended up working out really well, but we weren't necessarily like, we had some idea of what we were trying to do, but I don't think we were like trying to make that beta launch like a huge thing. And it definitely like things weren't just like totally like, you know, hockey stick from there. But I think it was really good sort of like initial feedback that we were able to get because of just like, I think launching as fast as we felt like ready to launch basically.
Did that beta help you identify like further like missionaries that like really loved your product or really like what your mission was, to help connect you guys to maybe more enterprise customers?
Yeah, I think we got a lot of really like helpful kind of like thought partners, and also just like people who are not afraid to like try things early. And so even like to this day, I think like some of those early customers are like very happy to be like the first people to try out some of like the products that we have, and having that cohort is like really valuable and also helpful then to be able to like, you know, when you are talking to like more enterprise customers, be like, yeah, this is like been in production for a long time, like people are using it. It makes it a lot easier to like ship new products. So I think like having kind of like those early advocates, but also people who are like happy to put up with like the pain of a beta product, and willing to give you feedback and like kind of be early adopters is super valuable.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes total sense. It's like critical information and context that you're getting from that beta, and often they're more willing to share, right? Because
Yeah.
they're already identified as early adopters of technology, so they're more willing to share with you like and be part of your journey. That's awesome.
Exactly.
And also, I was curious. So I'm looking at like Stitch's like website, for example, and you guys are clearly full suite now with all the different auth products that you offer. And it was built that way. That was intentional. Now, how do you go about communicating your messaging like across like all these different products now? Like that must be challenging for you guys.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's something we're like constantly iterating on. We were like discussing a new headline for the website last night. So it's like something we're trying to like constantly evolve. And I think one of the challenges of building such a sort of like comprehensive platform that is designed to be flexible and composable too, because it's kind of like it can be a lot of different things. And depending on what your use cases, your pain points are, there might be different things that like resonate for you. So I think it's something that, yeah, we're trying to constantly evolve. I think another sort of like interesting dimension is that we do fraud detection and prevention alongside authentication. And some of our competitors will say they do like bot detection and stuff like that, but it's just like a CAPTCHA integration, whereas we have like a sort of like in-house device fingerprinting product that's really sophisticated at identifying and blocking bots, returning users, basically traffic shaping of understanding like who is this person, are they a bot, are they a human, are they someone that you should let into your application, and trying to like nail that messaging when competitors are saying we have this, and we're like no, that's a different type, a different level of like fraud detection compared to what we're doing. We're going much deeper. And telling that story, I think, is something we're still kind of like trying to evolve. I think like overall, like the goal of Stitch is to build really powerful APIs that make authentication simple for developers, save you engineering time and resources, but still let you build exactly the experience that you want to build, not feel like you're sort of having to build around your auth vendor. And I think that's pretty consistent across like the people that we're selling to, but it's still a hard sort of like differentiation to communicate sometimes.
Yeah, it seems like that messaging has been consistent even since the inception of Stitch.
Yeah, I think there are definitely some things that have evolved quite a bit, but I think that focus on just like really powerful APIs has been sort of like the common thread throughout.
Yeah, that leads me to my next question, which is, how are you guys like thinking around like this future with like agents, and as they're becoming more and more complex, where they might even have like recursive learning, how are you going about like understanding like what is an agent? Or there's even talk of some like early stage auth providers that are thinking around like how they can create apps that interface with agents more easily, and like making auth more even friendly for agents and for interaction with like AI, for example.
Yeah, definitely. So I think there's kind of like two components to this. One is being able to like know who is trying to log into your app and allow the people in or agents in that you want to allow in. And that's more on kind of like the fraud detection and prevention side. Like, is this like anomalous activity or is this a normal login? If you say, hey, like, I don't want to allow like agents logging in, are we able to identify and block that? But if you do want to, are we able to say, okay, hey, this like looks like, sort of normal browsing behavior versus like this is like a high volume potential attack. Being able to distinguish between those, I think is really important. And then I think when it comes to kind of like that agent authentication, this all comes down to like identity and access management at the end of the day. Like, who is this entity? What do they have access to? What are their permission levels, et cetera? And I think it's still early. It'll be interesting to see kind of like how this continues to evolve. But I think OAuth is kind of like already designed for that use case of like granting access to programmatic entities that can like do actions on your behalf, right? Like I can, give permissions to Superhuman, for example, to control my Gmail inbox. And so I think we have like common patterns for how we do this today. And I think it's possible that sort of agents fit into that category. And there's permissioning that we end up building out of like how you can kind of like grant those permissions to an agent, and maybe companies that are like building these agents are like kind of building to spec. I think there's also a possibility that doesn't really end up being the case. And it's kind of like you maybe have agents that are just like acting on your behalf. And I think that's where like the more fraud detection piece comes into play, where it's like some of that behavior, if it's like, one agent on my laptop, like going off and kind of like doing some task for me, that's like pretty normal potentially, versus like if you're seeing really high volume, like hundreds of agents trying to like log into the same account or something like that. Like I think it'll be sort of interesting to see how this pans out, and it's something we're spending time on right now.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, this is great context into like how you guys think about like security, and like auth providers are thinking around like a future where everyone might have a personal agent and like how they access the internet. So it's really cool. Yeah, Julianna, so like last question here. Tell me something like weird about you that people don't know about you. Like you haven't talked about this anywhere else, and it's just something weird and strange, but like I'm sure I'd find it cool, and like I'm sure the audience would find it cool.
Yeah. I think this is something that like I think people on the team generally know, but I feel like I don't tend to like, I don't know, talk too much about my personal life. And I think I'm like kind of psycho when it comes to running. So I run pretty much every morning. Either I'll do like a berries workout or I'll go run outside. And I'm just like a little obsessive about like getting my run in every day. I think it like enables me to be much more kind of like flexible and easygoing in a lot of other ways. So I like choose that as my like one thing that I'm just like really obsessive about. And then if I get that in, I'm like happy to like, kind of take the punches as they come throughout the day, because you just have no idea like what's going to happen. And it's just like really nice to have something that I like can kind of like be consistent about, when a lot of like building a startup is not consistent. It's very unpredictable. It's very chaotic.
That's awesome, because that's actually something I was like talking about with a friend of mine when I arranged this podcast. I was like, Julianna's super humble. Like she actually went on this podcast with me. Super cool. She also looks in shape, and she just got engaged. So like clearly her relationships are pretty healthy. Like she's healthy. Like she's like got something figured out that like a lot of folks don't have figured out. And I want to get to the bottom of it. So I'm glad we ended it off on that note. Julianna, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. Yeah, it's been an absolute blast.
Awesome. Yeah, it was great chatting with you. And yeah, thanks for having me on.